The port city of Cherbourg was one of the most important objectives of the Allied armies following the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. Although immediate logistical needs could be provided by over-the-beach delivery and the revolutionary Mulberry artificial harbors, the Allies needed a significant port for prolonged combat operations. Cherbourg was the most feasible option near the landing beaches, and its rapid capture was an essential Allied objective. The Wehrmacht had presumed that any Allied landings in Lower Normandy would require a port. As a result, both Cherbourg and Le Havre were heavily fortified in 1942-44 as part of the Atlantic Wall program. This included the erection of an extensive network of coastal artillery batteries on both sides of the Cotentin Peninsula, extensive defenses in the immediate Cherbourg area, and the land front defense to the south of the city. On February 4, 1944, Hitler declared Cherbourg to be a Festung, fortress, which would be defended to the last man. We will take an extensive look on the battle storm that will involve the whole Cotentin Peninsula after the landings on June 6, a storm of immense proportions which will leave behind a scattered landscape of death and destruction in a pointless struggle for both sides. Strategic situation. German planning through the end of 1943 presumed that the Allied amphibious landings would strike across the narrowest portion of the channel against the Pas-de-Calais. A reassessment of this issue by Rundstedt's OB West headquarters in January 1944 led towards the Pas-de-Calais, but also highlighted potential landing sites in Lower Normandy. The two most likely landing areas were judged to be Cherbourg and Le Havre, based on the German view that harbors were the most likely objective. During his tour of the Atlantic Wall in February 1944, Rommel visited the future Omaha Beach and recognized the similarities of this sector to the Allied landing beaches at Salerno in September 1943. One of the reasons for his concern was that the Vire River estuary offered a variety of small harbors and also served as the eastern end of the Cotentin Peninsula, and so was a likely point to initiate any operation to cut off Cherbourg. His concerns about the sector led to the deployment of a 352 Infantry Division on the eastern side of the Vire River estuary, and the reinforcement of the forces in the Cotentin Elbow. And even Hitler began to have premonitions that the Allies might land somewhere other than the Pas-de-Calais. During a speech to German commanders in France on March 20th, 1944, he suggested, "The most suitable, and so most threatened areas are the two peninsulas in the west, Cherbourg and Brest, which are very tempting and offer the best possibilities for forming a beachhead." This assessment was also backed by the Navy, in form of Vice Admiral Theodor Krank, commander of the Kriegsmarine Marine Group Commando West, who judged from reconnaissance photos that had shown no activity in the ports of southern England or the mouth of the Thames, and the lack of bombing and mine-clearing raids on Cherbourg and Le Havre, that there was no significant threat to the Pas-de-Calais, but rather the Cotentin Peninsula, the Seine estuary near Le Havre, or the mouth of the Somme. The changing appreciation of the threat in the spring of 1944 led to German reinforcement of the Cotentin Peninsula, increasing the forces there from 1 division to 3 by May 1944. The western Cotentin coast had been lightly guarded since the Kriegsmarine had argued that the heavy seas, as well as the heavily defended Channel Islands, made amphibious landings unlikely. In mid-May, the Navy staff had a change of heart and began to suggest that the Allies might land on both the east and west coasts, with simultaneous attacks on either side of Cherbourg. Shortly afterwards, Rommel visited the area and later had a conference with Dolman and Marx about the state of defense in this sector. In May 1944, Schlieffen argued that the port facilities in Cherbourg should be sabotaged immediately to make the port an unattractive target and to permit units to withdraw to the base of the Cotentin Peninsula rather than becoming trapped. The Navy would not even consider such a plan, and Schlieffen's proposal was ignored. War games by AOK-7 in 1943-44 had studied the options for landings on the Cotentin Peninsula. These concluded that the two most likely landing sites would be the eastern beaches near the Vire River, or a future Utah Beach, or the Jobourg Peninsula, Cap de la Hague to the west of Cherbourg. Landings in the immediate Cherbourg area were viewed as unlikely because of the extensive cliffs along the coast, as well as the heavy concentration of coastal guns. And though the army remained skeptical about the vulnerability of the west coast, there were other problems to face. One of the central dilemmas in German planning, both before and after the D-Day invasion, was the operational mobility of Allied forces provided both by naval and air superiority. Allied naval dominance meant that the Allies could land nearly anywhere on the French coast. Not only did this affect deployments prior to the D-Day landings, but German commanders were constrained in moving units from the Pas-de-Calais or other locations to reinforce the Cherbourg Peninsula later in June for fear that the Allies would conduct subsequent landings after D-Day. Theodor Kronk would be right in his assumption concerning the Allied landing plans. The defeat of the Dieppe raid in August 1942 and the German fortification of the Normandy ports during the Atlantic Wall construction convinced Allied planners to conduct the amphibious landings against the weakly defended Normandy beaches away from the ports. By early 1943, planners had selected the Caen area as the focus of the attack. While Le Havre remained attractive, the need to ford the Seine River to secure Le Havre reduced its appeal as a short-term objective. Cherbourg became the default solution for quick capture. It was recognized from the outset that it lacked the capacity to support the 29 Allied divisions expected in the lodgment area by the late summer of 1944. As a result, the Overlord plan was enlarged to encompass the eventual capture of additional ports after Cherbourg, most notably ports in Brittany such as Brest and Quiberon Bay, or the Seine River ports such as Le Havre and Rouen. The capture of Cherbourg was a primary mission of the U.S. Army forces landing in Normandy. The original objective was to secure Cherbourg by day plus 14, by which time 18 Allied divisions would be ashore. The planned capture of Cherbourg was later pushed back to D plus 15, as Allied intelligence discovered the addition of new German units on the Cotentin Peninsula. The deployment of the 91st Luftland Division in the central Cotentin was discovered in mid-May 1944. The 7 Corps field orders, released on May 28, 1944, outlined the tactical approach to secure Cherbourg. The 7th Corps planned to push northward out of a beachhead with a single division along the Montebourg-Valognes axis, using the Douve River as a shield on its left flank. Early plans assumed a quick advance on Cherbourg, since German forces on the Cotentin Peninsula were so weak during the first months of 1944. At the time of the D-Day landings, there was no plan to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, as would eventually occur. While Task Force U was still slowly approaching the Cotentin Peninsula, everything was set up for the largest airborne invasion the world had seen until then. 6 hours before the scheduled seaborne assault, up to 13,000 men in 2 divisions comprising of 6 regiments with parachute field artillery, engineers, and other supporting elements were flown from bases in southern England to the peninsula in approximately 925 C-47s with an additional 4,000 men consisting of glider infantry with supporting weapons and medical and signal units, who were to arrive in 500 gliders later on D-Day and on D-Day +1. These airborne troops had the objective of capturing vital river crossings and securing the Utah Beach exit points. The 82nd Airborne was to land in drop zones N, O, and T to simultaneously capture the critical crossroad of Sainte-Mère-Église and ultimately block all German counterattacks and capture and hold the Merdorec River crossing at La Fière and Chef du Pont to prevent German counterattacks and ensure a swift river crossing on D-Day. The 101st, meanwhile, had a greater variety of objectives and was ordered to land on a less concentrated area with drop zones A, C, and D in order to first seize the 4 causeway exits from Utah Beach and then to secure the main bridges over the river Douve near Carentan. It was also to disrupt enemy communications and destroy as many German strongpoints as possible. Their further objectives were to link up with 82nd Airborne and 4th Infantry to establish defensive positions along a unified front. But as one of the greatest military historians of all time, Karl von Clausewitz, already wrote in 1832, "No plan survives contact with the enemy," and Eisenhower's plan did not survive the night of June 6th either. Poor weather and unexpectedly heavy anti-aircraft fire and navigational errors led to a chaotic and dispersed drop, and only a few units had more than 30% of their target personnel strength after assembly. In search of their units and assembly points, hundreds of scattered paratroopers wandered alone or in small groups through the impassable terrain of a bocage. Because of this dispersal of forces, neither of the two U.S. airborne divisions was able to effectively carry out all the orders given to them. The 101st Airborne Division was the first to land around 0130 hours on 6th of June 1944. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, PIR, and 506th PIR, less 1 battalion, were assigned to the primary objective of securing the Utah Beach exit points. The first wave of the 502nd PIR, consisting of the 2nd 502nd PIR and HQ 502nd PIR. The transport aircraft carrying these units were scattered by cloud cover and flak, landing far from drop zone A. Most of the 2nd 502nd PIR was dropped compactly but inaccurately on the far edge of a drop zone C, 3 miles south of intended drop zone A. The battalion landed in an area divided up by a maze of dense hedgerows, the Normandy bocage, and had a great deal of difficulty assembling and orienting themselves. These units spent most of the D-Day regrouping and took no part in the initial fighting. The 3rd 502nd PIR landed in very scattered fashion to the east of Sainte-Mère-Église. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, gathered around 75 men and began moving on the coastal battery of Saint-Martin-de-Varreville. They found that the guns had been removed and the position deserted due to pre-invasion bombardment, so they moved on to their next objective, the western side of Hauteville-la-Hubert Causeway, Exit 3, arriving there around 0730 hours. German troops of the IGR 919, abandoning strongpoint WN8, began retreating across this causeway around 0930 hours, and were ambushed by the concealed paratroopers, losing 50 to 75 men. This battalion also attempted to clear Exit 4, but failed due to German resistance, and the battalion spent the rest of the day collecting their scattered and missing men. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy's 1st 502nd PIR landed near Saint-Germain-de-Varreville with 20 of the 36 aircraft within a mile of a beacon. One group, led by Cassidy, moved towards the stone building near Mézières, the garrison for the German coastal battery at Saint-Martin-de-Varreville. Cassidy's group occupied the crossroads outside Mézières and determined that the two northern exits assigned to his battalion were clear. On meeting another group of about 45 men from his unit, he ordered them north to create a defensive perimeter near Foucarville. Cassidy kept about a company of troops near the crossroads to prevent any intervention against the beach from the west, and sent a squad to the eastern side of the Mézières to clean out any German troops. A team led by Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers killed or captured about 150 German troops in a series of one-sided encounters. As this action was winding down, the regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Michaels, arrived with 200 men. This freed up the remainder of Cassidy's men at the crossroads, who then followed the other paratroopers to Foucarville area. Cassidy's force advanced to the west, since the secondary mission of his unit was to link up with the 82nd Airborne Division that was scheduled to land near Sainte-Mère-Église. In doing so, a company became engaged in a series of encounters with German infantry around the village of Fournel that lasted through much of D-Day. The 1st 502nd PIR would hold the north perimeter throughout D-Day without serious challenge from the Germans except at Hameau-Fournel. Of all of the units in this sector, the 377th Parachute Field Artillery with 12 75mm pack howitzers was the most badly dispersed, with some even landing near the marshes around Saint-Marcouf and others far north around Boulogne. This meant there was no artillery fire support in this sector except for a single howitzer. The southern sector was the responsibility of the two battalions of the 506th PIR landing in drop zone C. The cloud bank disrupted the C-47s, and some aircraft passed over a concentration of German flak near Etienneville. 6 aircraft were shot down and 30 damaged. In spite of the fire, some drops were concentrated, with one serial of 14 aircraft dropping almost on top of Drop Zone C, another serial of 13 bunching their sticks a mile and a half east and southeast of a drop zone. But the other serials were much further from their intended targets due to a confusion over the beacons. About 140 men of the HQ and 1st 506th PIR assembled into the regimental area in the first hours of the landing, including the regimental commander, Colonel Sink. The 2nd 506th PIR landed north of the drop zone in the same area as the 501st PIR, but Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer managed to collect about 200 men by 0330 hours. Strayer's group began moving south to seize the areas behind the Houdienville exit 2 and Poupeville exit 1 causeways. Sink had no idea where Strayer's men had landed and so instructed the assembled paratroopers of Lieutenant Colonel William Turner's 1st 506 PIR to take control of the Poupeville exit 1 causeway. But Strayer's men were delayed by persistent German small-arm fires and wouldn't arrive in time. Next to land were the 3rd 501st PIR and the Divisional HQ, which was to control the planned glider landing area near Yesville. The 3rd 501st PIR lost 3 aircraft to flak on the approach. A force of about 300 paratroopers from the HQ and Lieutenant Colonel Julian Ewell's 3rd 501st PIR congregated near Yesville. General Taylor, not knowing what was happening with Strayer's and Turner's 2 columns, decided to ensure that the southernmost Poupeville causeway was under U.S. control, and so dispatched Colonel Ewell with 40 of his men around 06 hours. This was the first of the 3 paratrooper columns to actually reach the causeway around 08 hours. The 2nd GR 919 manned the WN6 strongpoint covering the western end of the causeway and WN2A on the beach itself. The defenses were poorly organized, but it took nearly 4 hours for the outnumbered paratroopers to overcome the German defenders in house-to-house fighting. The Germans surrendered around noon after suffering 25 casualties. 38 surrendered, and the remainder, who tried to escape across the causeway towards strongpoint WN2A on the beach, were later captured. About half of Ewell's men were casualties, but they reached exit 1. Fighting flared up near the divisional CP in Drop Zone C due to the presence nearby of troops from Artillery Regiment 191 centered around Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. The paratroopers gradually eliminated the batteries, and the town was finally cleared of German troops by mid-afternoon. The final groups to land were 1st 501st PIR, elements of the 2nd 501st PIR, the 3rd 506th PIR, as well as engineer and medical personnel. These forces were earmarked for Drop Zone D, the southernmost of the drop zones. The approach to the drop zone was hot, with a considerable amount of light flak, searchlights, and magnesium flares. 6 C-47s were shot down and 26 damaged. These drops were among the most successful in putting the paratroopers near their intended objective, but this was not entirely fortuitous, as the Germans had assumed that this area could be used for airborne landings. As this was the last of the divisional landings, the German troops in this sector were alerted and had troops near the landing zone. The 1st 501st PIR commander was killed and his executive officer captured. The regimental commander, Colonel Johnson, landed near the center of the zone and was able to rally about 150 paratroopers. He immediately set off for the primary objective, La Barquette locks controlling the flooding of the areas along the Douve River. The force brushed aside the German sentries and occupied the locks, but was soon under fire from German artillery. With the situation at the locks in hand around 09 hours, Johnson and about 50 paratroopers returned to the landing zone to seek reinforcements. About half of the 2nd 501st PIR was engaged in a sharp firefight around the village of Les Trouveries and had been unable to disengage and move south to the objective. Instead of encountering the single platoon expected in this sector, they were confronted by an entire battalion, the 3rd GIR 1058. They spent most of the day fighting around the town of Sainte-Côme-du-Mont. Johnson was able to collect a few additional paratroopers and set off to seize or destroy the bridges over the Douvre River below its junction with the Mer de Ray River. The 3rd Unit landing in Drop Zone D, the 3rd 506th PIR, had the roughest time. German troops were waiting in the landing area and had soaked a wood building with fuel. They set the building on fire, illuminating the descending paratroopers. The battalion commander and his executive officer were among those killed in the first moments. Captain Charles Shettle, the battalion S3, landed away from the main drop zone and set off to the Le Port bridge with about 15 men. This small group gradually increased in size as it attracted scattered paratroopers and emplaced itself at 2 of the bridges by 04:30 hours. They were forced back by German counterattacks around 06:30 hours as they were nearly out of ammunition. However, they took up position near the bridges and were able to keep the Germans at bay. Ironically, the next day, Shettle was able to call in a P-47 strike in hopes of attacking the German positions, but due to the confusion, the P-47 skip-bombed the bridges instead. The 82nd Airborne Division revised its plan on the 28th of May due to the discovery that the 91st Luftland Division had moved into its planned landing area. The 82nd Airborne's new assignment was to land 2 regiments on the western side of the Mer de Ray River and 1 regiment on the eastern side around Sainte-Mère-Église to secure the bridges over the Mer de Ray. The landings of the 82nd Airborne were even more badly scattered than those of the 101st Airborne, and as a result, only 1 of its regiments was able to carry out its assignment on D-Day. The 82nd Airborne began landing about an hour after the 101st Airborne, around 02:30 hours. The 505th PIR was assigned to land on Drop Zone O to the northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église. Unlike many other transport serials, those flying to Drop Zone O spotted the cloud bank early and managed to fly over it in a coordinated fashion. The only cloud problems were over the drop zone itself, forcing some C-47 pilots to initiate the drop higher than usual at 1,000 feet. The Pathfinders had done such a thorough job marking it that many aircraft circled back over the area to drop the paratroopers more accurately. This was the most precise series of jumps of any that night. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krause's 3rd 505th PIR was assigned to take the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and managed to assemble about 180 paratroopers. The town had been garrisoned by the supply element of a divisional anti-aircraft unit, Flak Regiment Hermann, but most of the 200 men of the unit left the town before the arrival of the paratroopers. Krause ordered his men into the town, killing about 10 German troops and capturing 30 others. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin van der Voort's 2nd 505th PIR collected about half its troops and set out to establish a defense line north of a drop zone as planned. However, at 09:30 hours, the German GR 1058 staged a counterattack against Sainte-Mère-Église from the south. The regimental commander, Colonel William Ekman, ordered van der Voort to return back southward to assist in the defense. Before doing so, he broke off a platoon to remain at Neuville and carry out the battalion's original perimeter north of the town. Lieutenant Turner Turnbull's platoon was hit by a German infantry company, but managed to hold its position during an 8-hour struggle. Only 16 of 44 paratroopers in Turnbull's platoon survived the fighting, but the platoon's defense shielded the battalion while it faced an even greater threat to the south. The 2nd 505th PIR arrived in Sainte-Mère-Église around 10:00 hours and took over part of the perimeter defense. The first German attack consisted of 2 companies from the Georgian Battalion 795 and troops of the 91st Luftland Division with a few of the division's Stu G3s. It was repulsed by the 3rd 505th PIR. Colonel Krause ordered a counterattack and about 80 men from Company 1 advanced southward along the road, hitting one of the retreating German convoys with a grenade attack. This was the one and only German attack of the day against the town. The 1st 505th PIR landed with the headquarters, including General Ridgway. Around 04 hours, Company A under Lieutenant John Wisner set off for La Fière Bridge with about 155 paratroopers. This increased in size as they approached the bridge, picking up stragglers from the 507th PIR and 508th PIR. The advance on the bridge was slowed by frequent encounters with German troops. An initial attempt to rush the bridge failed due to entrenched German machine gun teams, the first of several attempts that day in a confusing series of engagements. The two other regiments of the 82nd Airborne Division, landing in drop zones T and N on the west side of the Mer de Ré River, were hopelessly scattered. Pathfinders had been unable to mark the drop zones, in some cases due to the proximity of German troops. The transport aircraft were disrupted by the coastal cloud bank, and after arriving over a drop area, the pilots had searched in vain for the signals, or in some cases, homed in on the wrong beacons. Much of the 507th PIR was dropped into the marshes east of Drop Zone T, while the 508th was dropped south of Drop Zone N. These swamps were deep, and many of the heavily laden paratroopers drowned before they could free themselves of their equipment. In addition, a great deal of important equipment and supplies landed in the water, and valuable time had to be spent trying to retrieve this equipment. About half of the 508th PIR landed within 2 miles of the drop zone, but the remainder landed on the other side of the Mer de Ré River or were scattered to even more distant locations. The 507th PIR dropped in a tighter pattern than the 508th, but many aircraft overshot the drop zone, dumping the paratroopers into the swampy fringes of the Mer de Ré River. The most noticeable terrain feature in the area of the 507th PIR drop was a railroad line from Carentan on an embankment over the marshes. Many paratroopers gathered along the embankment. One of the few other coherent operations of the early morning on the west bank of the Mer de Ré involved a force assembled by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Shanley of the 2nd 508th PIR near Picauville. His assignment was to destroy the Douve Bridge at Pont-l'Abbé, but his force quickly came into contact with a German infantry battalion from GR 1057, involved in sealing off the west bank of the Mer de Ré River. Shanley withdrew his force to the battalion assembly area on Hill 30, and they fought a day-long engagement, shielding the operations of the forces near La Fière. By the afternoon of D-Day, there were 3 separated groups of paratroopers in the area around La Fière Bridge, about 300 paratroopers with Shanley, 120 with Times, and Schwarzwalder, and 400 with Cole George Millet of the 507th PIR on the east side of La Fière. All 3 groups were short on ammunition and under intense pressure from GR 1057. As will be detailed later, the fighting for La Fière continued for 3 days. At around 1300 hours on D-Day, a company of 1st Battalion 505th PIR, which had positioned itself on the east bank of La Fière Bridge after being repulsed twice during crossing attempts, is counterattacked by 3rd Company of a 100th Tank Training Battalion with 4 Hotchkiss H-38 tanks and small number of infantry. This tank battalion, though, could barely stand its name. Prior to D-Day, it reported some 17 operational tanks and a combat strength of 664 men. It was barely trained and consisted mostly out of non-Germans. Furthermore, the battalion could only attack along a narrow road within the flooded area, and therefore was unable to deploy across the full width of the road. Hence, attacking with a maximum of 2 tanks in frontal positions, the attack was doomed from the start. The 2 leading tanks were knocked out by bazooka teams, and in the next attack 1 tank drove on a mine, taking him out of action. The last Hotchkiss pressed on together with infantry, but was finally repulsed in the evening. The battles of the Mer de Ré River crossing, as a result, were somewhat indecisive, with neither one of the sides being able to cross the river, enforce or destroy the bridges. The remains of a 100 tank training battalion had spent the night at Bopt, blocking the D-903 road leading to Cotentin, and, quote, firing at everything that moved, end quote, after their battalion commander, Major Bartenschlager, went missing in action during the night. On the morning of the 7th, the 1st Company was ordered to Saint-Lô and 2nd to Carentan, leaving the rest of the battalion with only a handful of Panzerfausts and machine guns. After reviewing all of my available sources, I was still not able to confirm this information, and it's completely unknown to me what happened to these companies. It is very much possible that the 1st Company reached Saint-Lô and fought with whatever unit they encountered, but I can confirm that the 2nd Company never reached Carentan, which is also proven is that at least some of the tanks were captured intact by the Americans as shown in pictures at the time. Hence, it's most likely that some of the tanks got captured and that the remaining tanks fought on with the German units they encountered until their ammunition or fuel ran out. What is so interesting with this case is that the decision to split up the battalion into 2, or one could argue 3, combat groups was probably made by the deputy commander, because I find no evidence for orders from higher commands, nor was Major von der Heide, in command of the units in Carentan, informed about the coming reinforcements. The Germans' reactions to the landing were slow and uncoordinated, as we already saw, but there was one exception, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6. The Green Devils of Major von der Heide began their march from their initial positions eastwards shortly after midnight, and it was the 30th Company, a 3rd Battalion of the Green Devils, that encountered the 1st American paratroopers between Saint-Georges-de-Beaune and Rougeville. Then, at 2 p.m., the 3rd Battalion heading to Carentan again reported a large enemy force dropping from the sky, and soon 60 American soldiers were taken prisoner. It was around 4 p.m. when 3rd Battalion finally reached and secured Carentan. The rest of the regiment was also fighting against some unorganized or invaders, and the 1st Battalion had reached Booked, but apparently didn't make contact with the Tank Battalion, while the 2nd Battalion was fighting off a larger and better organized group near Raids, taking prisoners of a commander, a captain, a lieutenant, and 73 other ranks. At 6 a.m., Major von der Heide arrived in Carentan together with the 1st and later 2nd Battalion and the remnants of the already battered 3rd Battalion 1058 Regiment. Now in full strength, Hyde ordered his 1st Battalion to advance on and secure Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, while the 2nd Battalion received the order to perform recon on both sides of a large national road towards Cherbourg in order to ascertain if the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, which was elevated, was still free from enemy troops. With the 3rd Battalion as a reserve in Saint-Côme-du-Mont, 1st and 2nd should later swing to the coast and perform a pincer action to constrict and destroy the landing forces at Utah. But this did not happen. While 1st Battalion crossed the heights of Anglouville-aux-Plaines, it was attacked and subsequently halted by a much larger enemy force arriving in gliders. The 2nd Battalion, who almost reached Sainte-Mère-Église, was pushed back by an American tank force. With the 1st Battalion unable to advance on Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, it formed an all-around defense in front of American positions. Coming under naval fire and losing the support of 4th Battery 191st Artillery Regiment through an American ambush at sunset. Adding to the German chaos was a general lack of higher-ranking officers at their posts because of the issued weather reports that stated insufficient weather for landings until at least the 7th of June. These incidents led to a big officer meeting at Rennes planned for the 6th with a Kriegsspiel that should be taking place. Yet, unlike others, the 91st Divisional Commander Wilhelm Thalai didn't take the opportunity to leave early and enjoy the leisurely evening in the capital city of Brittany. Thus, he was on his way to Rennes when waves after waves of plane flew over his head in the darkness, dropping American paratroopers all over Cotentin. Ordering his driver to speed up, Thalai was only a few kilometers from his headquarters when at 1 a.m., June 6th, his staff car fell into an ambush led by 1st Lieutenant Brannan, 82nd Airborne. The car was riddled with bullets, crashing into a wall. Inside, Thalai was dead, killed only 1 hour into D-Day. He was among the very 1st German casualties, and the first, but definitely not last, German general to be killed during the Battle of Normandy. General Bernhard Klosterkemper took temporary command. On learning that the Americans had seized Sainte-Mère-Église, he ordered GR 1057 to begin to move east over the Mer de Ré via La Fière Bridge, where the regiment would become entangled with the 82nd Airborne Division over control of the Mer River crossings, as we already covered. The German beach defense looked formidable at first. The western coast is littered with strong points, or Westersternestern, and additionally, there are many strong coastal batteries on the shore. On Utah Beach especially, there were many strong points incorporated into the area's landmarks, such as former beach houses, mud forts, and dunes. The American had split the beach into two landing zones northeast of a small village, La Madeleine. Uncle Red, facing the formidable WN 106, and Tar Green, facing WN 100. The first wave consisted of only 8th Regiment Infantry, F and E companies of 2nd Battalion, and C and B companies of 1st Battalion, to be precise. The following waves were to bring the rest of the 8 regiments together with engineers, artillery, and armored support. But, unlike everything else this day, the seaborne assault did not go without error. Strong currents pulled the invasion forces off course and brought the first waves on a much narrower beach strip in front of WN 104, which actually was a blessing for the Americans because WN 104, or sometimes referred as WN 5, was, though initially formidable left, almost completely destroyed as a result of a previous 9th Army Air Force bombing of the beach positions, which was far more successful than its Omaha counterparts. Then came the Americans, and although one of their landing commanders, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., immediately noticed the landing error, he famously remarked, "Well, start the war from here." F, E, A, and B companies landed without much resistance and took WN 5 and its demoralized defenders under fire. F Company attacked via the left, C Company via the right flank, while E Company threw itself frontally at the enemy. This three-pronged attack proved too much for Lieutenant Yank's men, and he and his survivors almost immediately surrendered. With the small beachhead secured and the 2nd and 3rd waves on the beach, the 1st and 2nd Battalion of 8th Regiment stuck to the plan and expanded the beachhead. 2nd Battalion, intended to secure Causeway 1, pushed southwards with E and F companies, leading the attack on WN 4, which is overwhelmed in a short skirmish, while G and H Company advanced on and take WN 3 and the small village of Boguillot. Supported by C Company of the 70th Tank Battalion, the 2nd has orders to assemble and make contact with 101st paratroopers lying near Poupeville, just behind Causeway 1. The just landed 3rd Battalion was ordered to clear Causeway 2 for the following vehicles, and B Company of 70th Tank Battalion. But, as the 1st platoon of the latter moves down Causeway 2, it runs directly into a German anti-tank guns field of fire, which is positioned behind a blown culvert over a small stream. The 1st tank is stopped by a mine blowing one of its tracks, while its 2nd tank is knocked out by an AT gun, which is itself knocked out by the 3rd tank of the 1st platoon. After this action, the Germans retreat to Armeau-Germain with the 3rd Battalion hot on their heels until they encounter the enemy positions along the villages of Armeau-Germain and Braucourt-Manor, consisting of extensive dugouts with underground shelters and 3 or 4 88mm guns of 1 Company 919 Regiment. The Germans put up stiff resistance, but with the reinforced 1st Company of 8 Regiment attacking from the east and E Company of 506th PIR attacking from the north, the position is taken after a brief firefight with 50 Germans dead or wounded and about 100 taken prisoner. Further south, a similar encounter takes place while 2nd Battalion advances on the already American-controlled village of Poupeville to make contact with 3rd Battalion, 501st Regiment, and by doing so trapping some elements of 2nd Company, 919 Regiment, who are also forced to surrender. In the meantime, 1st Battalion of 8th Regiment, also reinforced by a tank of a company of the 70th, had secured Causeway 3 against some minor resistance of 3rd Company 919th Regiment and successfully made contact with 1st Company 3rd Battalion 502 PIR stationed at Hauteville-la-Hubert. With the 3 southwestern causeway secured and Hauptmann Fink's 1st Battalion 919 Regiment virtually destroyed, 8th Regiment had only one last goal: push towards and secure the 13th Route Nationale at Les Forges and send a small vanguard to make contact with the 82nd forces at Chef du Pont. With that being accomplished in the early evening, the 8th Infantry had reached its D-Day objectives. It had relieved elements of a 101st Airborne Division in the Poupeville area and was in a position to protect the southwest flank of the 4th Division. Only north of Les Forges did it encounter some difficulties. A finger of strong enemy resistance extended through Fauville to Turqueville. Entrenched along a ridge, parts of the German 3rd Battalion, 1058 Regiment, and 709 Division 795 Georgian OST Battalion blocked the Les Forges Sainte-Mère-Église highway and prevented contact between the 8th Infantry and the main body of the 82nd Airborne Division at Sainte-Mère-Église. Attacked earlier in the day by the 505th Parachute Infantry troops from Sainte-Mère-Église, the Germans had apparently given some ground to the north, but had consolidated against at Fauville. Further north, the Americans encountered far more difficulties. 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 22nd IR were to push in the hinterland of Exit 4 and then advance north via Foucarville, Ravenuville, and Kriegsbeck to the ridge west of Quinéville, while the 3rd BN was to advance directly along the beach to Quinéville, eliminating the German resistance nests one by one while doing so. But when the 22nd IR and its 3 battalions went ashore at Utah Beach around 10:15 on the morning of D-Day, the eastern approach to Exit 4 was still under heavy German artillery fire. This forced the men of 1st and 2nd BN to wade several kilometers through waist-deep wetlands to reach the western end of Exit 4, which led to delays of several hours. As a result, the 2 units were only able to advance as far as Saint-Germain-de-Varville, where their advance was halted by the last company of 1st Battalion, and they took up defensive positions overnight. The 3rd BN, 22nd IR, on the other hand, advanced north along the beach to the hamlet of Hamel-de-Crute, where it took up positions south of WN11. The 12th IR, which landed around noon and was supposed to advance to Magneville-Saint-Floxel line via exits 3 and 4, also had to wade through the wetlands due to the blocking of exit 4, thus also losing considerable time and only reaching Beauceville-aux-Plaines, which was still held by German forces of GR 919 before nightfall. But, with darkness approaching, there was time for one last tragedy. The finger of German resistance at Turqueville and Fauville lay directly in the landing area of the glider-borne artillery units of the 82nd. As such, the riflemen of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, reinforced with a tank company, twice attacked the enemy positions. 1 tank was destroyed in the 1st, and 3 tanks together, with about 100 riflemen in the 2nd. The enemy had not been budged at 21:00 when, on schedule, 60 C-47s appeared over the area with gliders in tow. Despite heavy fire, most of the gliders were cast loose over the German positions. Some came down in enemy lines, some drifted farther south, most crash-landed with high casualties. The German reactions on the landing began in the early afternoon as the assault battalion of the 7th Army is ordered to take up positions north of Neuville-aux-Plaines, together with 1st and 2nd Battalion 1058 Regiment to prepare for a counterattack on Sainte-Mère-Église the next day. In addition, a battle group under Lieutenant Ugrosk, including several Marder 1 tank destroyers of Panzerjägerrebitz 709, were sent to enforce this attack. But, as they passed through Asville without infantry support, they were beaten up by paratrooper 57mm anti-tank guns on the outskirts of Sainte-Mère-Église on D-Day. Well into the night of June 7th, the orders continue, and the Germans carried out major troop movements. Lieutenant General Helmich commander of the 243rd ID and also the most senior general of a German unit stationed on the Cotentin. According to an order issued by the 84 Corps before the invasion, Helmich was to take command of all troops fighting on the peninsula in the event of a landing on the Cotentin, ordered the commander of GR 922, Lieutenant Colonel Mueller, with a staff company of GR 922, its 3rd Battalion, Pioneer Battalion 243, and 1st GR 920 to move on the Montebourg area in a night march and to advance west along the Sainte-Floxel, Fontenay-sur-Mer, Ravenneauville Road on June 7th to prevent the expansion of the American bridgehead. Lieutenant General Helmich also moved the 3rd AR 243 located near Godard on the west coast to Écosseville area, where it was subordinated by the artillery regiment ZBV 621 Lieutenant Colonel Seidel. From Écosseville, the artillery was to support the attack on Sainte-Mère-Église planned for June 7th, together with the heavy artillery battalions 456 and 457, which had now also been detached from the 84th Corps of the 709th ID at the request of Lieutenant General von Schlieben. The general situation for the field commanders on both sides at the end of D-Day was one of uncertainty. On the Allied side, the commandment of the battles was greatly decentralized and initiative often laid in the hands of the battalion commanders. This was in part because 7th Corps headquarters was actually divided on D-Day, with some parts taking field command on the beachheads and some, including the Corps commander General Collins, stayed aboard the Bayfield. Most disturbing, though, was a lack of information about other units. This uncertainty had already affected the decisions of many commanders on D-Day, and was most keenly felt by the airborne units, particularly the 82nd Airborne Division, which had little or no knowledge of the course of a battle on other parts of a beachhead. The German side was even more complicated. While the higher commands never really considered the main landings to be on the Cotentin, the field commanders, like von Schlieben or Helmich, were very much aware of a threat to the division, but could do little without any orders. It was partly military incompetence and partly the fear of another landing at Cherbourg that kept many units in reserve for days. A difficult chain of commands, the lack of sufficient field communication, and unpreparedness of air and ground defenses, in addition to the German miscalculations of both his own and Allied capabilities, further hindered a real Axis defense on the beachhead. Despite all of this, the US 7th Corps troops deployed on D-Day were unable to fulfill all of the orders given to them. The 82nd AB did not succeed in establishing the 2 bridgeheads on the west bank of the Mer de Ré, nor could the 2 bridges on the Douve be blown up. 101st, on the other hand, was able to carry out most of the orders, but failed to capture Saint-Côme-du-Mont or blow up the 4 bridges on Route Nationale 13 between the Saint-Côme-du-Mont and Carentan. Although the 4th ID had a successful landing at Utah Beach with very few casualties, it was also far from achieving all of its objectives for the day. Only the 8th Infantry Regiment reached and secured its stated objectives, in contrast to the other 2 regiments. The 12th and 22nd IR were unable to achieve their objectives for the day due to significant delays in crossing the march area behind Utah Beach, which, as already stated, had been submerged. And with that, we enter the 7th of June. General Collins, commander of the 7th Corps, realized that his first mission would be to consolidate the beachhead due to the lingering dispersion of the paratroop forces. He still was not in touch with General Ridgway from the 82nd Airborne Division, and the first communications were not received until late on D+1. Thus, the primary mission of the day was to eliminate the German pocket south of Sainte-Mère-Église and to relieve the pressure on the northern sector of the town's defenses. By dawn, the 8th Infantry was poised along the enemy's southeastern flank, and attacks began the morning. Initially fruitless, things began to turn after a Russian-speaking GI convinced his captors about the desperate situation the soldiers were in. Initially, 75 Georgians surrendered, and the German battalion commander, Captain Stiller, then ordered to cease fire and surrendered with the remaining survivors of his battalion. 174 Georgians and Germans were taken prisoner and marched off to the landing beaches. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions had a much tougher fight against well-entrenched German defenders on the ridge at Fauville, but in the early afternoon the last resistance was overcome and the first units of 8th Regiment could establish communication with 505th PIR at Sainte-Mère-Église. It was about that time when the German 456 and 457 artillery battalions, together with the 3rd Battery of Artillery Regiment 243, started a short but heavy barrage on Sainte-Mère-Église, followed by the attack of 1st and 2nd Battalion 1058 Regiment and Assault Battalion 7, spearheaded by some assault guns of Panzerjäger Battalion 243, which managed to penetrate the American defenses and reach the northernmost part of Sainte-Mère-Église, after finally being stopped by tanks and anti-tank guns of the paratroopers of the 746th Tank Battalion. The Americans then launched 2 counterattacks in succession, in which the 2 battalions of GR 1058 were almost completely wiped out, with Colonel Beigang, commander of the GR 1058, also among the casualties. In the early evening of June 7th, several Sherman tanks of the 746th Tank Battalion then advanced to Neuville-aux-Plaines and occupied the town. However, the tanks withdrew again towards Sainte-Mère-Église at nightfall due to the lack of infantry support. Kampfgruppe, or Battle Group Muller, that should have supported the attack on its left flank, was halted in its track by heavy artillery fire of the Allied ships of Utah. With their left flank now secured, the 12th and 22nd Regiments now resumed their attack on Nasville and Kriegsbeck's batteries. These batteries had a significant number of other defensive fortifications, and they had also accumulated infantry troops who had retreated from the beaches. 2nd Battalion 12th Regiment took Bondianville and advanced on Neuville-aux-Plaines until Le Buisson, where it took up a defensive position. The 1st Battalion, meanwhile, advanced on its right flank to occupy the high ground between Le Buisson and Nasville. 3rd Battalion was centered behind as a regimental reserve, as the whole regiment came under heavy fire from the Asville battery. The first attack on the battery was repulsed, and after the second wave stalled, the units were counterattacked and pushed back to the defensive line, suffering heavy casualties by the hands of a despaired German garrison. The 2nd Battalion of the 22nd also pushed north against 3rd Battalion 922nd Regiment, being halted short of its objective, while 1st Battalion retreated from Saint-Marcouf after suffering heavy casualty at Kriegsbeck. The 3rd Battalion 22nd Infantry advanced northward along the coast and reduced the surviving German beachhead defense nests. Naval fire control parties helped direct the gunfire of warships against the bunkers. By the evening of D+1, the battalion had fought its way through all of the German defenses up to W11 when it was ordered to halt. Down south, Hauptmann Prekschatz 1st Battalion decided to pull back to Saint-Côme-du-Mont, just like the 2nd Battalion had done just hours before. But disaster struck on the morning of the 7th as the battalion ran into an American ambush that broke up and to some extent scattered the unit. Just then, realizing that his whole battalion was encircled by larger enemy formations, Prekschatz gave the order to "Save yourselves if you can!" But in the bitter fighting, all hope was lost, and on the evening of 7th of June, Hauptmann Prekschatz men, most of them wounded and unable to fight, accepted the offer of surrender from Colonel Johnson of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Over 50% of the battalion was killed, the rest taken prisoner, and only 25 men under the leadership of Lieutenant Stenzel managed to escape from the enemy and fight their way back to their own troops. On the evening of the 10th of June, the only thing they had to report to Major van der Heydt was the destruction of a brave 1st Battalion. In the afternoon, with 2nd and 3rd Battalions now under heavy enemy pressure, they retreated to Saint-Côme-du-Mont and managed to fight off the 506th and 502nd PIR and its tank support attacks with heavy casualties, leaving Major van der Heydt to conclude that they wouldn't be able to hold their positions for any longer without support. In general, by the end of June 7th, the German defenses around the American beachhead were hard-pressed. Grenadier Regiment 1058, facing the 4th Division around Sainte-Mère-Église, had been badly beaten and its commander killed. The neighboring GR 1057 along the Mer de Ré was being steadily pushed back by the 82nd Airborne Division. The 1st GR 919 of the 709th Infantry Division had been badly disrupted by the Utah Beach landings, and Carentan was everything but secure. Schlieffen was reluctant to redeploy the regiment's other two battalions positioned in the beach defense north of Utah Beach because of a conviction that the Americans would conduct additional amphibious landings farther up the coast over the next few days. But there was also one good message for the German defenders on the peninsula, because there was still no serious signs of an Allied landing in Brittany. On the evening of June 7th, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel ordered the 77th ID in the Saint-Malo area to move to Saint-Lô in order to be able to quickly provide assistance to the German units struggling on the Cotentin if the situation worsened, which it has. And, after the failed attacks on Sainte-Mère-Église on June 7th, Lieutenant General von Schlieffen, commander of the 709th ID, became convinced that his remaining troops no longer had the strength to recapture Sainte-Mère-Église and push back the American bridgehead, or even throw the Americans back into the sea. In order to prevent a further enemy advance to the north, or at least to delay it until reinforcements had arrived from the south, he ordered all available forces to withdraw to the Le Ham, Montebourg station, Montebourg, and Quinnéville defensive line on the evening of June 7th. In addition, the commanders of the bases and pockets of resistance on the northeast and north coast of the Cotentin were instructed to move their units to several assembly points inland, leaving only skeleton crews in the coastal positions. The American commanders were also in a bad mood. Although the 7th Corps had made solid progress on D+1, it was still behind schedule. Under the original plan, Collins had hoped that the 4th Division could rapidly exit the beachhead and begin advancing north toward Cherbourg. However, the fighting was progressing much more slowly than hoped due to the inability of the 82nd Airborne Division to control the Mer de Ré river crossings, the unexpected difficulties of infantry combat in the coastal hedgerows, and the 3-day delay in consolidating the badly scattered paratroopers. During a visit to Normandy on D+1, Eisenhower expressed his concern to Bradley that the Germans might exploit the gap between the 5th Corps on Omaha Beach and the 7th Corps on Utah. As a result, Bradley instructed Collins to focus his immediate attention on closing this gap by seizing Carentan. Acting on his orders, Collins issued the following to his corps on the evening of June 7th. The 4th ID was to advance further north, capture the 2 German batteries in Nasville and Quebec, and advance to Quinnéville-Montebourg station line. The division was to be supported on the left wing, west of Route Nationale 13, by the 505th PIR and the 2nd BN 325th Glider IR, both 82nd AB, which were to take the line Montebourg-Hérouville-Montebourg station, Le Ham. The units of the 82nd AB remaining on the Mer de Ré, on the other hand, were again to attempt to capture 2 bridgeheads at La Fière and Chef du Pont on the west bank of the Mer de Ré floodplain, while the 101st AB was to launch a renewed attack on Saint-Côme-du-Mont with the aim of capturing Carentan and subsequently advance on the Route Nationale, which ran through the Douve floodplain. I want to close this chapter with a Führer Befehl that was to be read to every soldier on the 7th Army after the invasion. Soldiers of the Western Front, the enemy has begun his long-awaited attack on Europe. His aim is well known of us all. You are called upon to frustrate him, thus guaranteeing our national security, our existence, and the future of our nation. In the victorious Western Offensive of May and June 1940, the military and materiel conditions for this clash were created. Since then, powerful fortifications have been built along Europe's coast through years of work. Here, you will now defend our continent. Here, you will smash the attack by our enemies against our people and our Reich. Soldiers, in this historic hour, I appeal to your bravery, to your proven courage, and to the steadfastness of your hearts. Your task is to deny the enemy entry to Europe at all costs. In this struggle, join the strength of your weapons with the strength in your souls. Defense against this attack is a matter of life and death for our nation and a historic task whose fateful dimension demands the very utmost from every one of you. Here, there can be no escape, no maneuver. Here, what counts is to stand, to hold, or to die. Every leader, every commander of a base, an island, or a fortress, or a ship is honor-bound to me never to capitulate. He will continue the struggle to the last fighter, to the last shell, to the last round. In these days, the German people and the entire world are looking at you. I know, my heroic soldiers, that each one of you is filled with a will to fight for a fortunate future for our people in the next few days, and ultimately to secure it. Wherever the enemy attacks, he must be destroyed. He will not succeed in gaining a foothold on a coast defended by us. Victory will therefore be ours. You are called upon to fight for it, and so fulfill the legacy of our fallen comrades.